Hi everyone! Who doesn't like to play an attacking game and finish it with a very nice sacrifice to give a checkmate? In today's video we're going to see a very young Magnus Carlsen 10 years before he became a world champion, and he's playing against his countryman John Ludwig Hammer. I'll analyze the game from black side because Magnus is playing as black, and my main goal with this video is not just to show you the moves and how Magnus plays very nice chess, but to understand the main principle behind the moves played by Magnus when he starts his attack. So I started the game with the move knight to f3, and here Magnus played a somewhat strange move. He went for d6. Black has many options here like knight to f6 or d5, but Magnus went for a sideline by going d6, and after d4 and knight to f6, here Hammer played the move knight b to d2, which is also not a main move. Here white could have played c4 and knight to c3, and most likely the game would have transposed into another opening, for example after g6, knight to c3, bishop to g7 and e4 we get a king's Indian defense. Knight b to d2 is not a bad move. It looks a bit strange to develop the knight there, but it has the idea to go e4. Here Magnus played g6, bishop to f5 was also an interesting move to prevent e4, but even allowing the move e4 here is not particularly dangerous. After e4, bishop to g7, bishop to d3, both sides castled. And here Magnus played a somewhat provocative move and went knight to c6. c5 here was very natural, trying to fight for the center, but Magnus went for knight to c6. He was most likely trying to complicate the game as much as possible in order to play for a win. And Hammer played very solidly, which is something that we see throughout the game, and here he played the move c3. So here d5 was possible, attacking the knight, but the main idea is that the knight can go to b4. Knight to b8 was also possible, but here knight to b4 has the idea to take the bishop. And if white decides to keep the bishop, for example by going bishop to e2, then this knight might come back to a6. After playing a5, if white attacks the knight will go back to a6, and it might come back to the game after knight to c5, putting pressure on e4. And now black has the idea to counterattack the center with either c6 or e6. That was an alternative, but Hammer decided to play more solid and went c3, and now Magnus fights for the center with e5. d5 was an alternative, but again Hammer wants to play solid, and he played h3, preventing some bishop to g4 ideas that would pin the knight on f3. And now Magnus went knight to h5 with the idea to bring the knight to f4. We see that developing the knight to d2 is blocking the bishop on c1, so the knight might come to f4. And now Hammer played d takes e5, and from now onwards until the very end of the game we're going to see Magnus playing forcing moves, that is either checks, threats or captures. So keep in mind this principle because it will help you understand his moves, and it will also improve you as a chess player when you have a position. So this way you will be able to find strong moves, and you will not limit to play the very first moves that come to mind that very often are not the strongest moves. So here in this position most of us would simply take this pawn on e5, but before taking on e5 Magnus plays the move knight to f4, which is a forcing move. It has the idea to capture the bishop on e3. And here Hammer played the move bishop to b5. As we'll see, there's going to be a slight drawback with this move. The bishop is loose. It was actually better to play the move bishop to c4. The bishop here is also more active. So bishop to b5 is probably a slight inaccuracy, and Magnus is going to be merciless. Here first he took on e5, and after knight takes e5, here again most of us would probably automatically capture the knight on e5 to get the piece back. But here Magnus played another forcing move, which is the move queen to g5. Taking on g2, giving a checkmate, is the main threat, but there might also be ideas to capture on h3, either with the knight or with the bishop, because the pawn on g2 is pinned. That's why white correctly played the move knight to g4, and now we see this slight drawback of the move bishop to b5, that the bishop is going to be loose there, so black got the piece back. Black already has a slightly better position. These two bishops are actually quite active. Even this bishop on c8 is already quite active. So here white continued with knight to b3, and now again Magnus followed this idea of playing forcing moves, and he gave a check on e2, and after king to h1, Now he captured the knight on g4, and after pawn takes, he brought this very passive rook on a8 to e8. Now there's the idea to capture the pawn on e4. And surprisingly, white's position is already quite awkward because there's no easy way to defend the pawn on e4. For example, playing f3 would lose material. After knight to g3, we fork the king and the rook. Playing knight to d2 here is a bit difficult to play, just a very passive move. Here black has many options, for instance, taking on c1, and after queen takes, defending on b2. Now black can keep on attacking, for example playing h5, planning to take on g4, and after pawn takes and queen takes, black gives a check, and black can continue, for example bishop to h6, pinning this knight, and planning to take on e4, so black is still better here. That's why Hammer decided to give the pawn e4 by going bishop to e3. It was actually better to go a4 before going for this idea, just to drive the queen away from the 5th rank, because as we see the queen is going to be very useful for black there. So here going a4 and after queen to c4, go bishop to e3. It was a better try, but black is still better here. Because after the move bishop to e3, we're gonna get a very nice finish. After black took on e4, here white's idea was to go rook to e1, attacking the knight on e2. But here Magnus found a beautiful finish, so I'm gonna give you a few seconds to see if you can find a checkmate for black in this position. So here Magnus played the very forcing queen to h5, giving a check, and in this position Hammer resigned, because we're gonna get a forced checkmate. g1 is controlled by the knight, so white has to take, and then after rook to h4, we get a very pretty checkmate with the rook and a knight. So let's recap the main idea that Magnus used to crush his opponent, but before that, let me first wish you a Merry Christmas, and hope that you can spend these days with your loved ones. And let me announce you some great news. I've recently launched my chess course that will teach you how to master Middlegames. In the course, I will teach you not only how to attack the king, but how you can also try to get an advantage by attacking other pieces. I also teach you the best way to defend and other advanced ideas, like how to evaluate when you should transition from a middle game to an ending. This course also contains activities to implement what you learn, and for the next days only, you can get a massive discount in addition to the bonuses that I provide. So let's go back to the main idea that Magnus used to demolish his opponent. So from here onwards, he simply played forcing moves, and let me give you a bonus tip. Most of the moves here were focusing on his opponent's side of the board. So here, instead of taking on e5, knight to f4 attacks something on the opponent's side of the board, and after bishop to b5, he took on e5, and after knight takes, another attacking move focusing on the opponent's side of the board, queen to g5, planning to give a checkmate, and after knight to g4, he took on b5, and after knight to b3, all of the moves were forcing moves, knight to e2, king to h1, bishop takes, rook a to e8, focusing on the opponent's side of the board, planning to capture this very important pawn e4, and after bishop to e3, rook takes, rook to e1. If you focus on attacking your opponent's king, this idea of playing rook to h4 giving a checkmate would come to mind, but since there's a pawn on g4, black cannot play this idea straight away, but only after sacrificing the queen by going queen to h5. So here black resigned, but the game would have continued, pawn takes, and rook to h4. So keep in mind this idea. After you develop your pieces, attack your opponent using forcing moves if that's possible. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time.